I am so excited to announce that I have released the first official tarot diagnosis spread book. Tarot and Self-Discovery is a therapeutic tarot journey with over 200 spreads, including over 152 card prompts and over 50 robust tarot spreads. You can purchase a physical copy on Amazon or a digital copy at thetarotdiagnosis.com. You are listening to The Tarot Diagnosis. I'm your host, Shannon. I'm a licensed psychotherapist, and I also happen to have a love for tarot. Each episode, I invite you to reflect with me as I work to demystify the tarot and the human experience, all while exploring tarot's connection to mental and emotional health. While this podcast may feel therapeutic, it is not meant to take the place of psychotherapy. So grab your cards and join me as I work to create a pathway to better understand ourselves and those around us. Hey, Eli.
Hello.
I'm super excited to have you on the podcast today because I feel like you're doing really important work, especially within the queer community. And something that I think is amazing is that you often utilize tarot as a tool in your work. And you're actually known as the Gender Doula. So in your gender work, you like to incorporate a lot of different, seemingly like occult tools, specifically tarot. And I'm just excited to explore that and find out how you use tarot to talk about gender and what that means to you. And I was hoping before we dive into all that, you could share with listeners, what does it mean to be a gender doula? And what does that look like? What type of work do you do? And how does tarot fit into all of that?
Yeah, these are great questions. So being a gender doula, I basically conceive of, at least my version of gender doula work, as full spectrum support for people who are questioning, exploring, or transitioning their gender. But I also support friends, family members, allies, and just folks who want to talk about gender, right? It doesn't even necessarily mean that folks want to explore or change anything. But sometimes people are just like, wait, I need to work out my relationship to my gender, even if I don't want to change anything about it, right? And so I support folks very, very broadly in the world of gender, which frankly touches everything, right? Sometimes I'm talking to people about jobs and the workspace. Sometimes it's wardrobe. Sometimes it's hormones and surgery. Sometimes it's spiritual, right? And so it's just this very, very broad thing that I've tried to sort of like corral by using this term gender doula. In terms of how tarot comes into that, actually, lots of different, as you mentioned, lots of different spiritual tools are a part of the work that I do. Tarot, for folks who desire it, can be a really good way for us to go deeper. Sometimes I'll be working with a person on gender doula work, and by their request, I'll have my deck present, and I can just pull when I get the sense that I need to. And then that often will deepen the conversation and lead us into places that maybe we wouldn't have talked about otherwise. I also do just straight up tarot reading for folks, right? Which may or may not have to do with gender, but again, gender has to do with everything. So that's kind of a part of it. And I'm also a breath worker. And so I use breath work with folks as well, and sometimes combine breath work and gender doula and tarot, as well as ritual. So it's kind of, I'm all over the map, but I have a lot that I do that sort of revolves around the world of gender.
You have so many things that I'm like making mental notes, like, oh wait, go back to this, go back to that, because I was really excited about a lot of the things you said. I'm just going to kind of go in order. One of the first things that you mentioned was the exploration of gender, whether that's through transitioning or even just someone who isn't questioning their gender and just needs help maybe exploring what it means to them and their relationship to it. I find that I'm doing that more often as a therapist. So the very beginning of my private practice career as a therapist, I really focused on the queer community, specifically trans folks. And that lately isn't the bulk of my practice. It's still a small portion of it. But I've noticed for a lot of my other clients, there have been an increase in conversations around what does it mean to embody masculinity? What does it mean to embody femininity? What does it mean to feel like I don't embody or want to adhere to any of these structures or constructs? And it's been incredibly powerful to have these conversations with folks and figure out, okay, yeah, like what are parts of you that you feel like you haven't been able to express or feel because of the messages or narratives that you've either received or created around the idea of gender. So I love that you have created this space where people can come in and talk about something that I feel like we've never been taught how to talk about. Like it's something, you're assigned female at birth, you're assigned male at birth, and that's it. And I feel like we've kind of gotten to this point in our society and different cultures where it's like, oh, well, no, like this is a pretty complex social construct that we need to peel layers back from and have discussions around and figure out how it truly impacts us and what it means for us and what we want it to mean for us. And then there was something else that you said about pulling cards. And I loved that you used the phrase, it can deepen the conversation, because that's something that I'm so passionate about when it comes to using tarot, because I feel like the cards allow us to access things or bring things up that aren't necessarily right at the surface for us. And I'm so glad that you have that same experience with tarot.
Yeah, absolutely. I think to your first point about the gender exploration piece, one of the things I believe that being trans gives one superpowers, kind of, or another way of phrasing this that I often use is that it gives us the opportunity to access sacred knowledges. And I think that those sacred knowledges, or however you want to conceive of it, allow us to be aware of these folds or spaces in sort of the fabric of reality that other people don't see. And so when we're talking about gender exploration, it's like, I think that gender exploration is equally valuable for all humans, right? Like, I think that it's good for everyone. But I think that if you are a person who doesn't identify as trans or doesn't know themselves to be trans, and you're working with a trans person for gender exploration, there are ways that I can see sort of like the cracks and the folds in a person's gender identity to help them fully embody their values in the world rather than embodying their idea of what their label means. And that's true no matter what the label is, right? Because nobody fits into a label well.
Right.
It's always an approximation.
Right, exactly. Like you can try and fit into a box, but there's always going to be a part of you that's kind of dangling outside the box because...
Exactly.
Yeah. I love the way you described that. So can you tell me a little bit more about how tarot can come into this process? And I know that you spoke about pulling cards in terms of deepening the conversation, but I'd love to talk about how we can use tarot to explore our own gender, our own relationship to our gender, because especially in the Rider-Waite-Smith, the more traditional decks, it is a very traditionally gendered set of cards. Mm-hmm. So how do you navigate that? And then I'm asking you several different things at once. How do you navigate that? And then how do you use it most effectively as a tool for this type of exploration?
Yeah. So I think, when I first started to learn tarot, of course, I immediately was like, wow, this is really gendered. Yikes. And then as I sort of started to develop my own relationship with the cards, I was like, okay, the genderedness of this is not the point, or it's not the important part of what this energy is trying to convey, And so what I did was I looked at like, what's actually happening here, right? When you have kings and queens, when you have emperor and empress, like what's actually happening here? And the idea that bubbled up from the exploration was that there are contrasting energies, and that contrasting energies are very, very helpful for delineating ideas or to understanding the differences in different archetypes or different ways of moving through the world. And that actually masculinity and femininity, or the things that we call masculinity and femininity, are quite unhelpful as structures because they're not reliable. They don't maintain the same meaning over time and space. Something that was considered to be masculine 50 years ago might be considered feminine now, or vice versa.
Exactly.
And even more so if you go back centuries, right?
Right.
And so I was like, okay, this is not a stable category. It's not super helpful. And it's often too culturally loaded for people to gain a lot of insight from it. However, if we think about contrasting energies that are not as culturally loaded, we actually gain much from that. And what I mean by contrasting energies is one of the most common ones would be like moon versus sun, which does carry sort of a gendered connotation in our culture currently. But one that doesn't would be, and this is one that my partner Junsa came up with, is the above ground of a plant and the below ground of a plant. So like above the soil, you have a stem or multiple stems. You have leaves, you have flowers, you have fruits, right? You have a thing that is alive that interacts with the light. It interacts with the sun and the moon and the bugs and the birds and humans and all sorts of living things and moving air, right? And then like under the ground, you have a root system. You have a thing that grows in the dark. It does not interact with sources of light. It still does interact with various sources of life, and it moves and grows and communicates in a completely different fashion, but both are part of a plant, right? Mm-hmm. And so when we think about the contrast between those two energies, that to me is much more productive than trying to think about, am I masculine or am I feminine?
Oh, it's such a beautiful way to describe that. For some reason, like it gives me Hanged Man vibes. This idea that we, we're normally upright, but we're, purposely, hanging upside down. I think the way that your partner describes this gives us a whole new perspective on how we can have or be these multifaceted, complex beings, and understand that it doesn't have to be an all or nothing concept. They're just energies that exist within us, or we are an energetic being. And like you said, some things are above ground and some things are below ground. And I wonder too, like when we're talking about exploring this, how much of a beneficial conversation that metaphor could spark, because now I'm in my head thinking, oh my God, I want to ask my clients so bad, like what's inside the soil? Mm-hmm. What does that look like? I think about, ants, for example. We're talking about plants, but I'm thinking about ants right now and how they can create these massive, hundreds of miles long and dozens of feet deep structures of tunnels. And I'm thinking about, if we were to work with clients and say, okay, what's down the first tunnel? What are we seeing? What is it like for you to sit in that space? What comes up for you? What's the temperature? What is, we're a little bit closer to the surface, but what happens when we get even deeper down? You're talking about the root structure. What happens when we get to the very, very bottom of the root structure of a plant? What's there? Which direction is this root going to start growing in next? And using that as a catalyst to help folks kind of explore this concept. And then when we get to the surface, that's what's seen, right? And there's so much that can be explored with that, because there's a lot of what we feel like we have to display to the world and what we want to display to the world. And then there's very much things that we can control about what is displayed to the world and things that we can't control. There's parts of, like, if we keep using the plant metaphor, the structure of the plant, based on, the conditions in which it was grown, it might be very full, or it might be more wilted versus the same type of plant that was grown somewhere else, but maybe didn't get as much sunlight. So, oh my gosh, there's so many different directions you could go just with that metaphor.
I know.
It's really exciting.
And honestly, when you were talking, I thought of a whole new part of it, which is like, I was thinking about the trees that have the big, gorgeous roots that are above the ground.
Yeah.
Like, they sit partially above the ground and then the rest is like underground. And then sometimes here in Los Angeles, like soil will erode and suddenly you see like this huge root system that wasn't available to you to see before. So I'm also thinking about this idea of like the roots above the ground, and like what it means for a thing to both be beneath and at the surface sort of simultaneously, and what parts of us occupy that arena as well. I mean, it's very rich, as you can see.
Absolutely. Oh my God. And then like, we're probably gonna have to move on from this a minute because I feel like we can keep going with it. Because now I'm like, but wait, trees actually talk to each other through their root system.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
I should have been a botanist. I love plants so much. Now I'm like, oh my gosh, but wait, what are these trees over here communicating to your tree? Or what do you need from these other trees?
Exactly. And like the different forms of communication, right? Like there's communication happening above the surface and then below the surface. It also takes away the sort of like, I mean, frankly, the racism of like demonizing anything that's quote unquote dark and like valorizing anything that's quote unquote light, right? It's like, no, actually like dark and light are qualities that are both beautiful, generative, rich, important, right? And this sort of takes that out of the equation as well.
Absolutely. Oh, that was so fun. I am excited to hear what folks have to say about that. I know my listeners will be super excited to dive into that. And I'm curious, like you had mentioned some specific cards earlier. We're talking about, gender. The Emperor and the Empress are super gendered archetypes. So for you, what is it like for you when you're using these? I know earlier you said, when you're looking at the tarot, you look at things as, what is happening, not necessarily why are these gendered or how gendered are they. You're looking at, kind of what's going on. So if, you were to explore the Emperor and the Empress in terms of the construct of gender or our relationship to gender, what would you say about those two cards?
Yeah, so Empress, well, first of all, with these two, I think it's really helpful to think about the ways that these archetypes show up that exist outside of gender. And I think this is one of those places where the sort of sacred knowledge and like the transness really comes in helpful, because if you've already reckoned with the fact that everything everyone has ever told you about your gender is wrong, then it's easier to reckon with the places where gender sort of shows up in these toxic ways. So you have the Empress, and listen, if you connect to the Empress as this like gorgeous feminine mother figure, I love that for you, right? Like if that's something that feels juicy and generative and gorgeous, I love that for you. And also, though, I think it's important to recognize that the sort of like fecundity and reproduction is not exclusively the property of any gender, right? Like we can all like occupy that space. And I think of this in terms of like an above ground, like tree producing like gorgeous flowers and fruits, right? And I'll just use hawthorn because hawthorn is one of my deepest herbal friends and allies. In a hawthorn tree, you have these gorgeous berries and these gorgeous blossoms, and they contain so much medicine, right? And when they sort of like burst forth, you can avail yourself of that medicine, which actually heals the heart, right? And that's so beautiful and so generative and not at all gendered. But then also at the fall, when those berries and blossoms and the leaves are lesser or gone, then you have these thorny branches that will protect, if you can work with thorn medicine, it will protect you, right? And so we're also thinking about that in terms of Emperor, this like idea of a tree sort of like protecting and like creating safety in a ecosystem for birds and other little creatures that might need to hide in those branches, right? Through the magic of thorns. And so in that one tree, you're experiencing both Empress and Emperor energy in these various ways and seasons. And I think each of us is that way, right? We have all of those multitudes inside of us, and where they come out and how they express may change from season to season or time to time or life experience to life experience, but we contain all these dimensions no matter what, right?
Yeah, I like the way that you're allowing us to step into the energy of the cards versus looking at the cards for kind of what they're showing at face value. And I think it was so important earlier when you said, if you view the Empress, for example, as this, beautiful gendered card of creation, like that's great. I love that each card can be related to by all of us. But I know that there are a lot of people who find that particular gendered archetype uncomfortable. And so giving people an opportunity to say, okay, well, what else is kind of really happening here? If we were to look beyond just what the image is showing, I always say, I feel like tarot is the same as when you walk into a museum and you're looking at the artwork. At least for me, I'm paying attention to, how is a piece making me feel? Is it making me feel tense? Is it making me feel loose? Is it making me feel curious? Is it making me laugh? Is it making me scowl? What is happening to me, like, physiologically? Am I having, what sort of visceral reaction is going on? And I think, like, for the Empress, for example, I think there's a lot of information that you can get if you look at that card and you feel soft and you want to kind of just like relax into it. That says one thing. And if you look at that card and you are tense, I think that there's a lot of information that can be gleaned from that. Whether it's, oh, do I need to talk about my relationship to gender, or do I need to find out why this card is making me tense and has nothing to do with gender? So I think you're giving us permission to really explore the energy in these archetypes.
Absolutely. And I think also with the Empress, one of the most helpful, I guess, ways that I've worked with that card is by having a devotional practice with Venus, who has gone by many names, right? For me, it started with Inanna. And, of course, there's like Aphrodite, like there's all these different versions of Venus. And lately I've been really interested in like the Orphic Venus and like reading all these incredible people's writings about Orphic hymns and all of that. And so that has been helpful to me because I've realized how much sexism is involved in the way that we think about the Empress and the way that we think about Venus, and how those things are demeaned. Like I think even when I was talking to a client recently, and they were noticing as we were speaking that their idea about things that are traditionally associated with Venus and with the feminine, like beauty, like love, like eroticism, reproduction, things like that they were sort of almost without even thinking about it, they were downgrading those things as less important than sort of like mystical experience or like, wisdom gained through, interaction with the divine. And it's like, it's all wisdom gained through interaction with the divine, right? Like the properties of Venus are so powerful, and it's really distressing that as a culture, we've lost that because of the demonization of femininity in general, or this thing we call femininity. But yeah, sorry, I know that's a little bit of a tangent, but I think for me, working with Venus as like, what is Venus as protection, right? What is Venus as like, not just reproduction in terms of like sexual reproduction, but also the creation of new life in terms of art, in terms of relationships with other people, right? Like there's so much power and miraculous, just incredible, explosive joy, and also all these other emotions that are woven through. And if you're just sort of like, oh, that's the goddess of love and beauty, then you're like missing out on all of that.
Yeah, you're missing out on all that. I think and you said something a second ago that is headed in the direction I was hoping we would go. You specifically asked, what is, Venus as protection? And we're talking about the Empress in this case. But that leads to a conversation. I'm thinking, okay, we tend to view the Empress as, soft and flowy and, creating life. We don't think of the word necessarily, at least I don't, maybe I'm projecting. I don't think about the word protection with her, but I would with the Emperor. And I was getting frustrated with myself, even just now, thinking, okay, well, can we apply characteristics of the Empress to the Emperor? And can we apply characteristics of the Emperor to the Empress?
Actually, that's one of my favorite, not in those same words, that's one of my favorite gender exploration games, I guess, or exercises that I give people. Is the exercise, put quickly, is that you think about the traits that you either have or that you want to have, and then you break them down into like how they are traditionally gendered, and then you flip the lens to how it would be gendered in the other, quote unquote, other direction. Right. So like, let's say that protection is the trait we're working with. Let's say that you want to be a protector, or you feel protective, or you're very good at protecting. right? And that's something that you want to maintain or encourage while you're exploring your gender and deciding how you want to show up in the world. Well, if protection is seen as this traditionally masculine thing or the purview of the masculine, how do we think of protection as a feminine quality or as something other than a masculine quality? And for Venus's protection, I've been in this exploration since last fall because of a relationship I've been developing with a talisman, which I got from a company called Idola Stellarum. And the person who creates the talismans, their name is Palace. And they were saying that the protection of Venus is the protection of an open heart. And like, that's what the talisman is meant to represent. And I do a lot of protection work because I'm a trans person who has a public persona. And I was like gagged by that. I was like, the protection of an open heart. Like, oh, and I'm still gagged. I'm still sitting with it. Like, I'm still in the process of like feeling into what that means and where that talisman shows up for me and how that relationship has developed. But it's like, when I think about the protection of Venus, and they wrote all this beautiful Orphic stuff about that and where they got that idea from. But I think like, okay, if I walk into a situation of great danger and I am open-hearted, what does that offer me? You know, it really harkens to the strength card in a lot of ways.
Oh my God, everything you're saying is so beautiful. It actually reminds me, I know someone who wrote a song about, you know, being pregnant and having their child. And they actually were talking about, like, the song talks about their heart being outside of their body because now like their heart, you know, belongs to this child, or the child is their heart. And the way they described it was so haunting. And now I'm thinking about, you know, this Empress energy and protection. And I'm just like, oh my God, well, of course, because, you know, you have that, you know, you've created something. And and it doesn't have to be life, but in this case, I'm kind of talking like it is because it's the person I know wrote this song. But it could be anything. And you have this desire and this drive then to make sure that it's safe and that it is protected. And it doesn't even have to be something outward. It could also be like you could be the thing that you're creating. And so when we think about like self-care and self-compassion and self-love, that's something that's so difficult for folks. And so to be able to say, you know, how can you offer yourself protection of your own open heart, what would that look like? I think could be really powerful and healing.
Absolutely. And also, like, when you were talking about that, I was thinking about like what other things other than a child, right? Because that is really powerful and potent. But for folks who do not have children or don't want them,
exactly.
You know, like, I'm thinking about, okay, if I want to create something, and like if that's art or a class or, you know, anything,
a version
and I
of ourselves.
Right. And if I want to put that out into the world, if I'm putting it out into the world from this really like guarded, walls up, like nobody come for me type vibe, then the people who would actually benefit from that creation or who could genuinely connect to it on a deep soul level will also be kept out of it. Right. Mm-hmm. And so there's this piece of that, especially when we're thinking about creating yourself as your own creation, right? If I come into the world and I am thrilled with who I have created myself to be, but I am completely walls up all the time, not available for connection, not open-hearted whatsoever, then how am I going to meet the people who are going to make my soul sing? You know, how am I going to meet the people who I could have those deep bond relationships with? Right. And so that's also the protection of an open heart is community.
I think what you're describing, I think is really important because I mean, how often have we wanted to share a version of ourselves, a part of ourselves, or share something that we've created, but have been so fearful to? And how often has that stopped us from either letting people truly see us or from experiencing these connections like you're talking about? And who knows, like we could have made an impact on someone, or we could have connected with someone who was able to make an impact on us. So I think what you're describing is an important reminder that we can still have an open heart and still protect it at the same time.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, I kind of want to move on to the Emperor now, because we've spent a lot of time talking about the Empress, and, now we allowed exploration of the word, protection, which I think we would typically think of as the Emperor, this rigid figure who is kind of like laying down the law and maybe more stoic and saying, no, you can't come here. Like there's a box and I'm the ruler and you can't cross this path. So I tend to think of that when I think of protection, but I'm wondering for you, when you think about applying these traits, you were talking about that exercise that you use with clients, what would you take from the Empress, for example, and apply to the Emperor?
Yeah, I love this question. So I would be nurturing.
Yes, absolutely. Please say more, because everyone I know has such an intense, sharp relationship with the Emperor. And I don't think many of them would apply the word nurturing. So please expand.
Yes, actually, it's so funny because this is actually how I came up with the exercise, is that when I was in the earlier part of my transition, I was also in a gender studies program at UCLA because I'm a huge nerd. And when I was like, I am troubled about gender, I guess I will go and become an expert in all things gender.
I felt that. Oh my God.
Right. It's so funny in hindsight, but I have so much love for that younger me that wanted to solve all their problems with academia.
Yeah.
But basically, I was in this gender studies program, so I was learning all the time about how awful patriarchy is and how much men have fucked up the world, just to be frank. And I was like, okay, I suspect that I may in fact be male. How do I actualize this identity without being a fucking nightmare for everyone? Right?
Without being a fucking nightmare. Yeah.
Exactly. And so this is just how I did it. Like nobody told me to do this, but I was like, well, I know that I have traits that are not considered masculine. And one of the traits that I had that was not considered masculine was that I'm a very nurturing person. I love to take care of people. People for my whole life have come to me and asked me for care. And I've had to develop so many boundaries to make this a healthy situation for myself. But it is something that I love when properly boundaried. Yeah. And so at that time, it was not properly boundaried. Let's just be clear. That's been a journey. But I was like, okay, I know that I'm a nurturing person and I know that this is considered feminine. And I know that I don't want to give this up and I don't want to become hard, just because I feel like I have to perform a certain type of masculinity. And so what does nurturing look like from a masculine perspective or in a masculine way? So that was actually like the beginning. That was the seed that has grown into this whole idea or way of looking at the world. And so when I talk about the Emperor as nurturing, the way that I like to think about this, and people who have read almost anything I've ever written will totally know what I'm about to say, because I talk about this all the time, but is the coastal live oak tree. So a coastal live oak tree here in California is a tree that is, when allowed to be mature, is absolutely takes up so much space, right? Like not only do they grow up, but they also just kind of squiggle around. Like they will grow left for a while and then straight up and then right. Like they're just all over the place. So they take up massive amounts of space and they're very beautiful. And also they support at least 270 different species just by existing. So when I think about the Emperor and I think about the coastal live oak, I think about that process of taking up space, but taking up space and supporting your ecosystem, like fulfilling that deep functional role in the ecosystem that allows the creatures and the lives and the energies around you to flourish at their best, right? And you don't have any control over what those creatures do with their flourishing, but you can provide the platform from which these creatures can grow, right? Or can be nourished. And so I think about this sort of like deep nourishment that doesn't come from shrinking down, doesn't come from making your needs smaller, doesn't come from sort of like hiding in the background. Like these trees are out there. They are squiggling, and they are like deeply, deeply important as foundational cornerstone species for this entire biosphere.
I love that we're talking so much about plants. I had no idea that's what we were going to do today, but I'm nerding out. I'm having so much fun thinking about these trees and these plants. And I love the idea of connecting specifically the emperor to this coastal live oak, or really any, larger, sturdy tree, because I feel like this really does encompass both the softness and the hardness that we automatically attribute to this card, but not necessarily in a negative way. Like these trees are incredibly sturdy and yet intimidating at the same time, but intimidating not necessarily in a negative way. It's kind of like when you have that awe experience, like it's the awe intimidation of, wow, look at you. Look at what you're able to maintain. Look at what you're able to provide. Look at what you're able to sustain. And I think that all of that embodies that emperor energy without a lot of the kind of harsh negative connotations that it's easy for us to feel about that card, because I think it is an archetype that we tend to liken to, or I guess bunch together with the patriarchy. And I think this is a way to maybe personalize an archetype a little bit more.
Right. I mean, it's like, yeah, the authoritarian, patriarchal emperor energy exists, right? Like we are living in it all the time.
Right.
And also it's like, okay, there's got to be a new relationship to this archetype such that we can start to think about how we would implement this relationship in our lives and in our world to have some hope of not extincting ourselves,
I'd love for you to maybe also share some insight or even some suggestions, because we're talking so much about the emperor and the empress. Even with these archetypes or other archetypes, how would you recommend folks start to, if they are feeling called to examine their relationship with their gender, where might they start, especially like with these cards or other cards?
Yeah, I think that especially with the cards in general, if you are interested in gender exploration and you want to do that work with tarot, I would highly encourage picking out either every card of the deck that you personally find to be gendered, right? Which is going to be different for everyone, to be honest. Or just starting with your whole deck, right? And pull a card and look at it and be like, how does this relate to me? And not in terms of labels, like not in terms of masculine or feminine, because I find labels are very unhelpful for the most part, but especially when you're exploring your gender, labels will shut you down from possibilities that you may not want to be shut down from really early, right? And so trying to like relax the hold of labels and just ask yourself, what are the values of this card? What are the traits of this card? And which of those values and which of those traits resonate to me, either as things I possess currently or as values or traits I would like to emulate in the future, or that I would like to bring my gender to those things, right? And the purpose of this, again, is to release this need to fit into a label of, male or female or trans or non-binary or genderqueer, literally any label, right? Releasing that long enough to see who you actually are, so that if/when you decide to incorporate a label, you're understanding that it's an approximation that's allowing you to be understood by the people around you, and not the fullness of who you are or what your identity is or how you show up.
That's a really powerful exercise. I'll turn it into a lovely graphic and tag you.
Love it.
And let people know that they can hear you explain it on the podcast, because that's so beautiful. I love the idea of combining traits and values, and the the idea of sitting with which ones already resonate with you, which ones are easy to identify and acknowledge, and which ones do you want to work towards embodying. I think it's a really empowering exercise because it's not what do I have and what am I deficient in? It's more what can I work towards, which I think is an important way to view this type of work in general.
Yeah.
I'd love for you to tell folks where they can find you and even work with you.
Yeah, so right now, my website is thegenderdoula.com, and I'm only really on Instagram and sort of kind of on Threads, and my handle is the Gender Doula on both those platforms. The best way to stay in touch with me and to know what's going on is to be on my mailing list, because that is a space of consent that is not modulated by an algorithm. So we love the mailing list.
Yes.
And you can sign up for that on my website or on the link in my bio on social media if you'd like. Right now I have a wait list for one-on-one work, although folks are welcome to reach out and get on that. I do have, every fall, I teach a class called Snake Medicine, which is a class about navigating personal evolution through the snake's shed process. So we create like a roadmap and toolkit for times of intense growth or grief or struggle, which is very helpful. It's underworld journey road mapping, basically. So that'll be coming up probably in September. Well, definitely in September, but I'm not sure the exact date yet. And then a lot of the gender exploration stuff that we've talked about today is a part of a gender exploration class that I'm not sure when I'll teach again, but if you're on the newsletter, you'll know when it comes out. I have all kinds of offerings. And yeah, again, the newsletter is just the best way to see them.
Thank you so much for listening to The Tarot Diagnosis. For more tarot and mental health content, follow The Tarot Diagnosis on Instagram. You can also subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode, and sign up to receive the Tarot Diagnosis emails, where you'll have access to exclusive spreads and exciting announcements. To join an incredible community of tarot and psychology enthusiasts, join the Tarot Diagnosis membership community, The Symposium, by visiting thetarotdiagnosis.com.